I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about, is Hypersmell the real ADHD superpower? Preface for this one is that this topic of ability to smell and ADHD is the most scantily researched of all the topics I've probably touched on so far. And it's not just scantily researched, it is conflictingly. About 3 studies suggesting that children with ADHD substantially better than neurotypical children at detecting smells. This is one of the few areas where people with ADHD as a group are clearly outperforming neurotypical individuals. There certainly can be situations with distracting noise or other situations where ADHD may be a benefit, but this is sort of an absolute neurophysiologic measure, which shows a superiority. Some people propose this may be the ADHD superpower, and others have proposed that children with ADHD are different enough on their ability to detect smells that this may eventually become a biomarker or test for ADHD. I think that's pretty premature. And summary is that the results in adults is pretty conflicting and not showing consistent advantages for smell. So part of why I got into this topic is I did get over the last months a few different inquiries, and they came from both ends of the spectrum. Some people were saying, I have ADHD and I seem hypersensitive to smells, and is that common to people with ADHD? And the other end of the spectrum, people either commenting in themselves or in others that I have ADHD and I seem to be less aware or less attuned to smells than other people. Maybe people with ADHD are overrepresented at both ends of the spectrum. And some of the confusion is that there are differences just between sensitivity to smell, whether you can actually detect the smell, and whether you are aware of it and processing it. So olfaction, or the sense of smell. So many people during COVID have suffered either acutely. 40 to 50% of people with COVID lost smell for at least some period of time and or had disrupted sense of smell. Up to 10% of people on COVID have ongoing impairment of smell. It's the only sensory system where the nerve is actually directly immersed in the world of sensing. So yes, our retinas are an extension of our brain, but the retina is protected by the lens. It's protected by the vitreous humor. There's a buffer between what we're seeing and retinal activation. But with olfaction, the nerves are directly responding. So the nerves are sticking out into the world, a more direct input to our central nervous system than our other sensory systems have. Most of our other senses get processed through midbrain thalamic entities before we're making any sense of them in a sensory way. So visual information goes through the thalamus. Olfactory, most of that is processed outside of the thalamus. So it's, again, a more direct, shorter pathway. Olfactory bulb is pretty close to both the frontal areas of the brain, which are involved in a whole bunch of personality, individual thinking, and really closely tied to the limbic system as well. So part of the power of olfaction may be its closer, more direct, fewer links to get into higher brain processes. Other cool things about the olfactory system is that they are cells, nerves of the human brain that are capable of regeneration, constantly using our olfactory system, even if we're not consciously aware that we are actively sniffing, engaging, drawing olfactant, smelling molecules into our nose. Smell system is actually a pretty good one. We often compare ourselves poorly to pigs or dogs or other animals, but in interesting experiments done a few decades ago by Noam Sobel, he was at UC Berkeley. He had volunteers who could follow a trail with their nose of scent through the grass extremely accurately. What helped actually in terms of following an olfactory trail was to have all your other senses blocked off. So your vision blocked off, your tactile sensation, your ears, because most of the information we're getting from our other sensory channels, we pay much more attention to. And in his studies, people could follow a scent trail through the grass on their hands and knees as fast as they could crawl. So crawling was the limiting factor, not an ADD anecdote or research, but article that got a fair amount of attention just in the last month was a research project on social anxiety. They were using a meditative approach to help people with social anxiety become more comfortable in a social situation. And what they did was expose these individuals with social anxiety to sweat or to no sweat from people who were watching a scary movie or a happy movie. Both the happy sweat and the scary sweat compared to the no sweat condition improved performance, actually doubled the efficacy of the meditation mindfulness in reducing anxiety. Importantly doing, and again, not well understood or conceptualized now, is helping regulate our autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system stimulants tap into the startle, arousal, fight or flight system, and the balancing parasympathetic nervous system. And part of maintaining that balance and part of a 2.5-hour cycle of nasal flow is probably tied into our sense of smell. Part of what's difficult about studying smell is we don't have a good or useful language for doing it. We have a more intricate testing system. So visual cues, we can put all sorts of visual designs up. We can describe precisely in terms of size, orientation of lines, wavelength of color, how we are varying the visual stimuli or acoustic stimuli. We can change the volume, change the pitch. Olfaction, we are working in a more categorical system. And many people have thought that our sense of smell is individualistic, that it's hard to know what someone else is describing the same thing, but they've actually done a fair amount of work that our olfactory maps are actually remarkably similar. Not identical, there are people who love chocolate and hate vanilla and vice versa, but in general, striking similarities in terms of how closely related we think different smells are and general correlations across people in terms of their pleasantness or aversiveness. And they're developing algorithms right now for more precisely mapping out and being able to predict if I expose these chemicals to you, what do you sense is going there on an olfactory level. So right now, most of the smell testing is collections of agreed upon smells. So we have test smell kits and we expose individuals to those smells and you display them at a certain dose in the nasal cavity and see how sensitive people are at detecting them. And in the ADD research, there's a few studies with kids showing that the kids with ADHD were substantially better. So they had lower threshold, which means they could detect the sense at a lower level of concentration. Additional studies with kids with ADHD, one study showed that kids with ADHD also had a larger olfactory bulb. Kids with ADHD, their smelling gets worse than normal ADHD kids and more like normal kids. Conversely, there's at least one study in just people with obesity, not with any ADHD in the picture, where stimulants given to people with obesity actually improve their olfactory sensitivity. So we know that dopamine processes in the frontal brain are involved with both with ADHD and with smell sensitivity, but what's going on between the two is complex. So again, unfortunately, even though there's a handful of small studies in children showing the superiority, in adults, there's much less consistent data. So there's some data showing most adults with ADHD actually have impairment of olfactory sensitivity. There's other studies showing no difference between adults with ADHD and neurotypical adults. One of the groups, again, pushing this in kids may be a real biomarker, felt that the difference, the separation was so robust that it could be used. We certainly need to do much more research to find out how substantial that is. And then other confounding factors are, we known, and we've talked about it here, that there is a big overlap between ASD, autism spectrum disorders, and sensory processing problems are much more prevalent in the autism spectrum than in ADD per se. Again, the study looking at ADHD and olfactory sensitivity was tried to get a pure ADHD picture without autism confusion, confounding. There's very little data here. So I would actually not promote Hypersmell as an ADHD superpower, being able to appreciate our differences. And it's not just how we are different, but how each of our traits or weaknesses or strengths are able to display themselves is probably more important. There's one other area, there's some research with ADHD and smell, and that is generalization that has not been completely substantiated, as many people with ADHD are picky eaters. Now, are they picky eaters because they are hypersensitive to taste? The studies there are actually completely conflicting. Some showed they couldn't actually find that kids with ADHD were pickier. Some found that kids with ADHD were more sensitive, but not more picky. Some found that they were pickier, but not more sensitive to smell. So we're in an area with very little replicated research. Hopefully we will be getting more of that increasingly down the line, rather than just looking at taste, which is interesting in feeding. One serious question, again, since chemosensitivity and how you are smelling the people around you is important for affiliation, making connections, aggression, a whole sort of other things, whether some of these social issues and problems that have measured in people with ADHD may be partly due to differences in olfactory processing. So in summary, I would not claim Hypersmell to be an ADHD overall superpower. Yours is great, good. If you haven't gotten COVID yet, keep working to protect yourself from COVID. So stay healthy, stay happy,